In this lecture, we're going to go over the organization of the nervous system. We're going to focus on the structure of the neuron, the central versus the peripheral nervous system, and reflexes. And we're also going to briefly talk about synaptic transmission, which will actually be in with the structure of the neuron. So right here in the darker color, you're looking at a typical neuron, and of course, you remember that that axon here in the center is going to be disproportionately large. I just can't draw it like that. So if we start to take a look at the different parts, out here you've got dendrites, and these tree-like branches are going to be responsible for picking up a signal from another neuron, or possibly being what is delivering the initial signal after receiving a stimulus. Here in the center, you've got the soma, or the cell body. And just like in any cell of the body, you're going to find certain features. You've got your nucleus, you've got your endoplasmic reticulum. Remember, there's going to be a lot of chemicals that are going to need to be made, proteins and other chemicals that are synthesized by your endoplasmic reticulum, and some Golgi, lots of mitochondria, because there's a lot of energy that's going to be needed. So that's this part of the body, or this part of the cell. Now remember, this one is incredibly long. We're talking possibly up to 1 meter, possibly more in length, and that's called the axon. And down at the bottom, we've got the terminal end. And every now and then you'll hear these little guys referred to as terminal buttons. So what you're looking at right now is just what's called a non-myelinated cell, or a non-myelinated axon. These are going to be a lot slower in transmission because there's no coating over the axon to give it a little bit of insulation. So I'm going to quickly draw in what myelin is. And those are going to be little cells that wrap themselves all along the axon. And these are acting as, like I said, little insulators, so that the sodium and potassium that's constantly getting in and out doesn't leak as much along a myelinated, and in fact, you're only going to need to have the action potential here, 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 and so on. So each one of these are called a different myelin sheath, and we're going to specifically call these Schwann cells. And in between each of the Schwann cells, you've got little nodes called nodes of Ranvier. And nodes of Ranvier are what are actually sending the signal. And IB does not require you to understand the difference of how an action potential travels along a myelinated versus a non-myelinated cell. All that you need to consider is, if this were not myelinated, then an action potential would move the whole way down. It's a little bit different here, and not something you need to know for IB, but if you're curious, in myelinated cells, you're going to have a signal being sent from the dendrites to the cell body and then down. But then instead of going all the way down, which can be a fairly slow process, it's going to go down and then jump over each of the Schwann cells, or each of the myelinated areas. So it's going to be a much faster synaptic transmission than having to go the whole way down. Still a fast process in either way, but just a little quick FYI for you. And now we'll take a quick look at what's going on between this presynaptic cell over here, meaning the one before the synapse. Here's your synaptic cleft, and the postsynaptic cell, here would be your dendrite. Remember, this is where you're going to have a quick influx of calcium, and that calcium was caused by the entrance of an action potential down the terminal end. And that calcium influx is going to take a whole bunch of vesicles, which were just sitting in that terminal button, and send them out using exocytosis. And again, that NT there is neurotransmitter. So the vesicles are going to exocytose with the cell membrane, releasing the neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft, which are then going to be received by a receiver or a receptor that's going right here. So these little receptors are a type of ion channel. So when the neurotransmitter comes in contact with one of these little neurotransmitter receptors, that's going to cause a gate to open up. So each one of these are, in addition to receptors for the neurotransmitters, they're ion channels. So these are going to open up and allow ions to diffuse in. So again, the ion channels have opened, sodium is now being let in, and that's going to initiate a new action potential, depending on whether or not we overcome that threshold. Okay, and our new action potential is going to travel down along to the terminal end to continue that signal elsewhere. So here's an overall schematic of the human nervous system. I've divided it into two different colors because there's two different functional parts that you need to be aware of. Your central nervous system, here in the darker color, is comprised of your brain and spinal cord. And your central nervous system is going to be responsible for picking up signals that the rest of your body has sent to it, determining what to do with that message, and then kicking out some kind of response. The rest of your nervous system, in this lighter color over here, is referred to as the peripheral nervous system. And your peripheral nervous system has two roles, either picking up a signal, like sensing some kind of stimulus, or kicking out a response in terms of some kind of action and telling something else in the body what to do. And so let's take a look at this a different way. I'm going to highlight just actually four neurons that are both part of this pathway. And so let's start over here. We've got some kind of sensory thing happening in the neuron right down here. And so this is the dendrites of the neuron picking up some kind of signal, such as you're touching something. That's going to send a signal back up to the central nervous system. Now, it might or might not go up to the brain depending on what the sensation is. If it's the sensation of pain and your body must immediately react and move it, it won't even go up to the brain. It'll just have a quick synapse and then send a signal back out. It depends on the situation, but just typically, here we go. So you've got a stimulus right here. So maybe your finger is touching something wet, and right now your hand doesn't want to be wet, so your neuron right here is going to pick up the signal, send it up. There's going to be a synapse. This is the symbol for synapse. Send the signal up to the brain and back down. During this part, some kind of decision has been made to send to this particular neuron, the cell body, the axon, the terminal end. And that terminal end could meet up with or synapse with a muscle to have some kind of an effect. For example, move your hand or continue splashing or whatever the decision has been made. And so if we label everything here, there's really three parts that we need to be looking at. The first is our sensory area, and depending on what you're looking at, there's a couple different terms for this. So IB will want you to know that this is your sensory part of the nerve. This is your sensory input. Something has been picked up down here from a stimulus and is being sent from the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system. The second part up here is going to be your relay area. So in the case of any kind of reflex, for example, if your sensory nerve has picked up that your hand is on fire, it is not going to make it all the way up to the brain. There's no point in having your brain make a decision about it. Instead, you're going to have some kind of synapse that goes from the spine and directly back down. So if you have somebody who's been cut off right about here, for example, a paraplegic or a quadriplegic who's had a neck injury, even though they don't have any neurons that go from the spinal cord up to the brain, or even though some of those are severed, they'll still have reflexes. The knee-jerk reflex is another one of them, where somebody that taps on the knee's going to kick. It's not your brain making that decision. It's going to be the spinal cord right here. If you're on fire, even though you can't feel it as pain, even though your brain doesn't quite pick up that signal yet, your spinal cord is going to be able to relay that nerve and send it to a motor neuron down here. That's going to be the third part. Send that message down very, very quickly so that you don't have to have the brain making any kind of decision. So the relay is going to be some part of the central nervous system, either the brain or the spinal cord, most likely both, but not always. And then finally, we move down here, as I alluded to before, to the third part of this called the motor neuron. And a motor neuron is also called an efferent neuron. Don't know if I mentioned this. If we take a look right up here, these are the standard symbols. So this right here would be the terminal end. This right here are the dendrites. So the dendrites are picking up the signal from this synaptic cleft here, sending the signal down the axon. And then we're going to synapse down here with some type of muscle, possibly a gland, depending on what the response is that we want to get. And so here we've got a terminal end secreting a neurotransmitter being picked up by a muscle cell so that your hand or your finger flinches back or continues doing what it's doing, depending on the decision made by the relay part of the nervous system. Okay, so if we come back over here, let's start to really talk about what are the parts of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system and how do they work together. In your brain, you have a total of 12 different nerves that come from the brain and extend out to the rest of the face or the rest of the upper part of the body. And these are called your cranial nerves. I'm going to draw them in that lighter pink. I haven't drawn them yet. So these are coming from the brainstem, and there's 12 pairs. I'm just drawing 2 here. One of them is going to be the optic nerve. You have 11 others. When you get to college, you'll probably need to know all 12 of them. And then extending down off of the spinal cord, you have another 31 pairs of nerves. They're pretty well shown here. And these are each called your spinal nerves. And you have a mix of motor and sensory in your spinal nerves. So each one of these nerves might be mixed, able to pick up a signal and then relay in the spine or brain and then send that signal back out. So again, sensory and motor nerves located in your spinal nerves. Okay, so we've talked about everything that we need to for IB. The rest of this video is just going to be a quick overview of your nervous system so that if you're ever interested, you can kind of put this all in a framework. So if you want to stop watching now, that's fine. We've covered everything that we need to. This is more for your own information. So I'm going to take the nervous system and break it down into how does it function in different parts. So again, we've got your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system. And your peripheral has the 2 divisions that we already discussed, which are going to be your sensory and motor. Okay, so on a very simplistic view, we've always got a signal going from your sensory, meaning that you're picking up some kind of stimulus. It's sending the signal from the peripheral nervous system to the central and back over to the motor. Okay, so we're going like this, kind of like that. All right. However, there's more divisions than what we think of. So when you start thinking about your nervous system, my guess is that you're thinking of the most obvious. You touch something, it's unpleasant, your central nervous system then tells your motor nervous system to move. But there's actually 2 parts of your motor system that we can be thinking about. We can be thinking about skeletal muscle or different types of muscle, or we could think about glands. And I know you never think about telling your armpit glands to start secreting sweat, but they do it. So we're going to look a little bit more into how that happens. So in your sensory motor, there's going to be sensory peripheral nervous system. There's 2 divisions, so we're going to further break the sensory down into somatic. And if we remember from genetics, somatics refers to the body cells. So just a typical response. We'll talk about examples here in a minute. And then visceral. And viscera is like an old-timey word for like your guts, but there's a lot more than just your guts. So what are some examples of somatic sensory? Those are things that you're used to thinking about. Touch, pain, temperature. If you feel something hot, you're going to move your hand. If you feel something cold, you're going to try to move your hand. There's also like proprioception. You can talk about that later on. Hearing and vision are all types of somatic sensory. So all of that would then be sent to the brain. Let's say you see something, that's part of that somatic sensory. You see something, it gets sent to the brain for some kind of interpretation and then sending it down the motor. But your visceral are things that you don't tend to think about. These are going to be things like stretch receptors, and you don't have stretch receptors on your skin to the degree that you do in your body. One example of a stretch receptor is in your bladder. So when your bladder starts to go from like pea size to stretch to get bigger and bigger and bigger because, well, it's filling up with urine, then your visceral nervous system, your visceral sensory part of your peripheral nervous system says, okay, I kind of got to pee, got to regulate my osmotic balance, and then you're going to need to go to the bathroom and recognize that. Some other examples are going to be chemical changes in your gut. For example, if all of a sudden you're inundated with a lot of protein in your stomach or a lot of fiber, different receptors are going to pick these up and act differently depending on what kind of food is present. Nausea. You feel nausea because of your visceral sensory. And so on and so forth. Anyway, what I really want to get to is over here on the motor side, because just like we did for sensory, there's going to be two sides to this. You've got your somatic, and that's the easy one to imagine. Anytime I hear people talk about only using 10% of their brain, they're really referring to this right here, meaning that you're able to control your brain, and 10% of your brain is actively controlling what your body's doing. So these are what are called skeletal or voluntary muscle actions. So if I tell you to run, you can run. If I tell you to grip something, you can grip something. But what's really interesting is over here on what we call the autonomic, auto meaning self, nomic meaning that this is doing everything on its own. You don't have to consciously tell your motor neurons to do something if it's part of the autonomic nervous system. So this is what gets really good. We can think about heart muscle, and even muscles that are called smooth muscle, which you'll be able to find in your gut and in your, even around your arteries and your blood vessels. You can have small amounts of smooth muscles so that you're able to dilate your different vessels more easily. You also have glands. So all of these things you have no control over consciously. You can't tell your stomach to start peristalsis faster. You can't tell glands to start secreting sweat or to start secreting more insulin. If you could, then you'd be activating that other 90% of the brain that Hollywood likes to think we just have shut off and not doing anything. I don't know that you'd necessarily want to, but hey, to each their own. And this gets further divided into two parts that I'm sure you've heard of before, but never under these names. Okay, so these are going to be your sympathetic and your parasympathetic parts of your autonomic motor nervous system. So kind of zoom out a little bit so that we can see this. We're in the peripheral nervous system, meaning not your brain or spine. The motor, meaning the parts that you're able to move or things that cause some kind of response. Autonomic, meaning you don't have control over it. Now, parasympathetic and sympathetic are referring to what kind of response. Oops, here we go. What kind of response are you getting? So when we talk about a sympathetic response, that is going to be your fight or flight. Yeah, now it's coming back to you because most people have heard of this. When you're panicked, when you are encountering something scary and you know that you're going to need to run or fight, certain things are going to be activated in your sympathetic nervous system while other things are inactivated. For example, when you are scared, you have an increased heart rate, you have increased sweat, you have increased vasodilation so that more blood is getting to your muscles so that you're able to run if you need to. And you've got less blood going to your viscera or your gut because what's the point in digesting and spending energy on digesting food that you've got in there if you're going to need to run? You want to spend the maximum amount of energy on running. You also have dilated pupils so that your eyes are seeing as much as it could be coming in. And conversely, our parasympathetic nervous system does the exact opposite. This is your rest or digest. And so when you're nice and calm and there's no immediate threat, why would you spend energy dilating your pupils, making sweat, making your heart go faster? What the real energy needs to be spent on is sending blood flow to your gut. increase the total amount of blood that is getting to your gut so that you're able to digest. Everything's calm. You don't have any extraneous energy spent because you don't need to. So this is the reason that after an adrenaline rush and you've got that fight or flight response and you're terrified and something crazy's happened, it's very common to feel incredibly nauseous afterwards because you haven't been sending very much blood to your stomach, because that's part of your parasympathetic, and we shut down the parasympathetic when the sympathetic's in play. Anyway, just a quick little overview as you go into college, or if you ever do anything having to do with the nervous system. I think this is a great way of picturing where all of the different responses that your body does, there we go, where all of those responses are. So maybe come back to this in 10 years if YouTube still exists and if I haven't deleted my video. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I will see you on Tuesday.